Hello everyone and welcome to the Business of Animation 101. This was a talk recorded previously. I'm giving a little intro. My name is Kathryn Taccone, and I just wanted to let you know that there are going to be plenty of resources, plenty of ways to connect with me at the end of the talk. So I hope you enjoy, and if you have any questions, let me know. Let's get into it. Give you guys a rundown of the Business of Animation 101. This is as much information as I could possibly put in at kind of a 30,000 foot overview. But where we're going to start with this is I just want to be very open about the reality of where we are in life. There was clearly some terrible fires that have been happening in LA. For all of you who are in LA, I am thinking of you constantly, and I want you to be as safe as possible. So if you need to leave for any reason, please go. Your safety and priority come first. If you have the means with which to help out other people, please consider going to different websites like the Animation Guild. There's lots of different relief sources there, and anything that you can provide to people is really helpful, right? We are a community, we're a global community, and we look out for people. So just keep that in mind as we're going through. Okay. With that, I wanted to give you a little bit about myself and sort of why you might even be listening to me. My name is Kathryn Taccone. I am a co-founder of Open Pixel Studios alongside my partner, William Colon. We have been in the business for the last 8 years now as owners. I have primarily worked as a character animator in the video game space for more than a decade, many years. I'll age myself. Now currently in like the commercial advertising space, which we will talk about. I have also I've run this kind of workshop before, mostly through Women in Animation over the last 5 years. And I've kind of put accumulation of everything I've learned about how to teach it there over here. And I also served as a Rise Up animation mentor for a long time while they were doing the mentorship program. So hopefully all of that experience will benefit us today. We'll see. But today, my goal for you is to address a question of business and art. How do they actually work together? Oftentimes, I think it's pretty obvious that when we see stuff that's happening, you might have experienced this too. If you've worked at a studio and you've served as an artist, how often have you actually connected with the people on the business side? Have you ever met the sales team? Have you ever met the IT folks? Have you ever met like people on the other, quote unquote, other side of the aisle? It always feels like there's this disconnect between the two. So we're going to take a deeper look into how they can actually work together so that you can run a successful studio. I have a couple expectations for you all today. Let me actually put this somewhere that makes more sense. Maybe in this corner for now. Okay. So my expectations for you all today are cameras are optional, of course, but please engage in the chat. Anytime you see this like sort of handwriting emoji, that's an indication that there's a prompt there for you to actually participate. So please keep that in mind. I'm totally, again, supporter of lurkers, but yes, I want you to be engaged and have conversations with other people. This is probably going to be about an hour and a half. If you don't have time, totally fine. This is being recorded. I'm going to have a Q&A both in the middle and in the end, and you'll see why in a sec. But it's also an opportunity for you to connect with each other. I want you to be able to share ways for people to reach out to you, so you should introduce yourselves to each other in the chat at this time. Feel free to post your whatever social handles you want to share with other people, but this is a place to connect with others as well. Especially for those of you who are starting your animation studios, I want you to be not alone in that journey, because it can feel very lonely at times. And then yes, I do expect you to come back and watch the recording afterwards. There is too much information to try to absorb in a single sitting. My brain would break, your brain might break. So I want you to be mindful of just absorbing what you can today, and then we'll figure out going back to anything later. So it's there for you as you need it. Okay, great. And I'll try to share out, I'll save out if you put your contact info in the chat. I'll probably save the chat before we are done. That way you guys can, I can like share out a link with everybody's contact info in there. Okay. So today's outcomes and what hopefully you're going to walk away with. I split this up into 2 sections, which is why we'll have a Q&A in between. The first section is kind of a 30,000 foot overview of the animation side or the business side of the animation industry. We'll talk about the market. We'll talk about a day in the life of CEOs, what that looks like, and we'll talk about business development structure. And then we'll take a little break to regroup, get some water, all that good stuff. And then we'll jump in to do more of a step-by-step guide for how to start your own studio. So that is very tailored to people who want to start their own studios. We'll talk about the key components to building a company. We'll talk about some knowledge and terminology around business. And we'll talk about any advice and resources for getting started. So with that, in order to actually get started, I prompted you all at the very beginning of this conversation at the registration point to understand why you wanted to learn business development in the first place. I read through about 150 responses, which was wonderful that you all participated. But it was a lot to go through. I took out some highlights here about what you specifically wanted to learn today. Everything is a vibe. I'm going to do my best to give you that. But you wanted some education that hadn't been taught at schools at all, which is very true. I think my partner, Will, he's the one he taught a class at Hampshire College about how to start the business side of animation production. And that's the only person I've seen so far that's teaching it, at least in the university space. But if you do know people who are teaching it, please share that, because it's good to know that those resources do exist. A lot of people wanted to build a sustainable business model, which is wonderful to see. And some of you are trying to figure out if you even have what it takes to do your own thing. I'm here to tell you that you do. And it's just a matter of figuring out what works best for you within that. Okay. So a question here. Why learn business development in the first place, right? Here's some things that I want you to learn today. I want you to learn so that you can be better informed about the reasons behind business decisions. If you think of things like anytime we see articles about what's happening with like a TV show being canceled or things that basically, what's the term, grind our gears or make us really upset and angry about what's going on in the industry, I feel that anger and I'm with you. But it is important to understand a little bit more about what's going on the back end of things. Because usually these decisions are a little more complicated than what we see on an article. I also want you to see how both the creative and the business side need to work together in order to make a sustainable model. And I also want you to be able to make informed decisions about the studios you work for. Somebody mentioned earlier that frustration of working for studios for a number of different reasons, which we can get into and have event sesh for sure. But I also want you to be able to avoid potential pitfalls when you're starting your own studios, specifically for those who are interested in doing that. So, knowing that, where do we start on this journey? Is there any right or wrong way to jump into business development? I don't know. Yes, so we're going to start by talking about the animation industry analysis. We're going to take a look at what's happening in the industry as a whole. As you guys already probably know, animation is a medium, right? You've heard people like Guillermo del Toro talk about this, but animation is really versatile, right? It can be used in so many different ways. And that means that the industry as a whole is a lot bigger than you might think. And it's more widespread than we typically realize. But your first tip in understanding the business side of production here is that your clients, your customers, people that are buying animation from you may not understand this concept. And I want you to keep that in mind, because when I'm framing a lot of the talk today, we're talking a lot, I'm going to do it through the lens of a client or a potential customer or even a business owner, so that you have an understanding of what they're seeing, because it might be a little bit different than what we typically see and what we know. Right? We know animation is a medium, that's true, but what they know is a little different. So if we take a look, every day as an owner, I'm kind of paying attention to 2 different things. I'm paying attention to what the market is telling me it's going to be. If we look at something that says, animation is going to grow to $580 billion by 2032. that sounds nice. That sounds like some money I could use. I'm sure we could all use that. But I'm also looking at the reality of things, right? I think a lot of us live in the reality and not what the market is projecting. Because we know in reality, not everyone is going to get an equal share of that nice financial pie that exists. We also know that there are actually over 200 animation studios in the US alone. So there's a lot of other people that are doing these. Not everyone is making feature films. Not everyone's doing commercial work. There's a lot of different things that are happening. And due to the recent layoffs over the last couple of years, I've seen it already, and I've seen the interest and demand that you're bringing, that more people are going to be starting studios than ever before. I do not see that as competition. I see that as something that's very exciting. There's lots of opportunities to collaborate, and there's lots of different ways to get into it. So typically, one of the questions that I get, if somebody says, I want to start an animation studio, I usually go ahead and say, okay, great. Where do you want to be? Because there are actually a lot of sectors or categories that the animation industry is broken up into. And I want to get a sense of how many of them you actually know. So what do you believe, and you can put it in the chat, what do you believe are some major sectors? If you were to take the whole industry and break it up into little chunks to better talk about it, what do you think is a major sector that exists? I'll give you the obvious one, which is feature film, right? Feature film is a major sector of the industry. I'm seeing visual effects. I'm seeing episodic TV, advertising, social media, television, yes. Game animation, yes. Kids, we'll talk about this. Medical, product visualization. Okay, these are wonderful. I have gone through with a number of mentees to kind of see what we came up with. We kind of came up with 8 specific sectors. You might categorize these a little bit differently, and that's okay. There's no, as you probably already know, there's no set standard for everything as we're talking through this. But yes, the sectors that I typically see are visual effects, feature film, television, video games, commercial advertising usually gets lumped in together. Indie film, right? If you work on short films and documentary, that's a huge section of the industry. VR, AR, and MR, right? Sometimes there are video game studios that just work in games, and then there's a whole other side of studios that are just doing virtual reality work. And you have social web. We can't forget about all the amazing people who are doing work on YouTube or webtoons, webcomics, all that good stuff. But something to keep in mind is that there are actually even more categories than this because there are subsectors of the industry. These are areas that can typically tie into multiple major sectors and typically have specific focuses in mind. So the example I'll give you here are museums. There are animation studios that just specifically work on museum content. Because if you think about a museum, they might need a commercial or advertisement for that particular museum. They might be working on an in-game app so that there's an interactive space. They might do some VR for that museum. So they're kind of like a one-stop shop for that particular museum. And so there's plenty of studios that exist like this. So I'm curious if you can think of other types of sectors in our world that utilize those major sectors. Any thoughts there? It's a little trickier. I'm going to give you a sec. Government. Government training videos, architecture with VR. Training vids, yes. Oh, these are good. Concert background visuals. Oh, I didn't even consider events. You're right. Courtrooms. Yes. Okay. There's lots here. I'm going to have to add to this list because you're bringing up a lot of great points. Okay. So I would say these are some of the subsectors that we've thought of, but I'm going to have to add to this now. This is why I wanted to ask you all. There's a lot of subsectors. Architecture was a big one, right? It can be utilized in multiple ways. Anytime you have web and app development, a lot of times those are utilizing animation in a variety of ways as well. Training simulations, government, parks and attractions are a big one, right? Your Disneys, your Universals, your Six Flags of the world, those are all going to have different types of animation and attractions to go with them. So all of that is just to say that the industry is huge, and where you're going to get started is going to be somewhere in here. I don't know where personally, that's up to you. But just know that you're not like pigeonholed into one particular thing. You can try to figure out what speaks to you out of this particular list, and I have to add more to it. But something else to consider is that these sectors are constantly shifting. The industry is changing and evolving, it's adapting based on what I would consider a variety of out-of-control factors, right? These are things that for me as a person with some deep anxiety, I freak out about a lot on a day-to-day basis, right? Technology, we're talking about AI, what's happening there. People have asked me if they should start their own AI studios, which is a whole other thing. We can talk about that later, but just keep that in the back of your mind. But there are things like politics, right? Taxes are going to be affected. If your tax code changes and suddenly you get put into a new tax bracket and now you have to think about how you're going to deal with your new set of fun taxes to pay, these are things that we can only react to and respond to and adapt to, but we cannot control, right? We cannot control what's happening with our environment. So what we can do is just be mindful of what we can do in those particular moments in the sector that we're in. So I'm not saying this to intimidate you. I'm just saying that this is part of the reality of when you're thinking about starting a studio, what business owners are constantly looking at and considering, right? In addition to the animation that you're making. So with all of that in mind, it seems a little scary. Why would people want to start studios in the first place? Some people say that entrepreneurs are crazy. So why would they get into it? I wanted to share some of your responses that you had. You had a lot of different reasons for why you would even consider starting a studio. But a lot of these are a culmination of a summary of what I've seen. You are hoping for creative freedom. You have a passion for animation and storytelling. You want better working conditions. I get that. You want sustainability. You want to build community, and you want independence. A lot of these are shared between all of you in terms of what you're hoping for a better studio environment. And you have the ability to create it, which is wonderful. All of those reasons, whatever that might be, even if your reason is like, I want to make $1 bajillion, that's fine. It has value. Okay, just hold on to that as we go through what think about what your reason is and keep that with you as you're going forward in this. Okay, I want to give you a little bit of a day in the life of a CEO. What does it typically look like? The spoiler alert here is that it's mostly communications, it's mostly meetings, it's mostly the fun joys of stuff that maybe you didn't want to do in the first place. But I have a very, very accurate chart on the left-hand side here. I believe that what typically goes into a day-to-day is a little bit of business development, a little bit of creative development, a little bit of personal development, working on yourself as a human being, and a whole lot of fucking up along the way. Sorry for swearing, but that's the reality. There is an idea here that none of this this is all dependent on the size of the studio that you're working at, but this is typically what's happening every single day at a studio. And as an owner, you're managing kind of those 4 sectors as best you possibly can. It depends on the scale though, right? So if you're a small studio, let's say, you're thinking about your role on a couple different fronts because you are working as both the business owner and the creative at the same time, right? Full-time freelancers are dealing with this all the time. So this is what my day typically looks like. I'm on the business side. I might be working on operations and figuring out new processes that we're going to have or building new ideas. But I also am project managing. I am taking care of our clients and figuring out schedules and managing communications. On top of that, I'm also managing the sales, right? Making sure that we have calls with potential clients coming in. I'm sending out estimates to figure out how much we could charge for something. But then I might, switch back and go to character animation and do my thing for a couple hours and serve that creative role as I need. And then I might be doing some marketing, building out some social media posts. I might be going to a speaking engagement. I might be doing something like this. Or I might be creative directing. I'm overseeing a visual style or I'm addressing any client concerns. all of this is happening. So the smaller the studio, the more roles one single person is solving for, right? Which can be pretty intimidating to be like, oh, I'm now, I have to switch my business hat constantly. Today I'm a marketer, tomorrow I'm a salesperson, and then the day after that, I'm all 5 of these at once. It can be a little exhausting, but it's just good to be aware of as you're seeing if this is what you want to be doing. Because ultimately, as you start to grow, there are lots of different stages that a company goes through over time. This is an article from the Harvard Business Review. It is really actually very informative. I would encourage you to read through it if you're interested in this stuff. But there are 5-ish stages of development that typically happen over time with companies. As they grow, their organizations change. They start to work and focus on different areas, right? For those of you who have started a studio, I'm always curious, like where you're kind of at on this front. But the one thing that I think is very interesting to think about from an owner's perspective is that the relationship with the studio will change over time. And what this means is that if you actually look at like the little white circle, I believe that's the owner, and the red is the company and the company size. So your role will change over time. Right now, I could tell you that like my studio is probably somewhere between survival and success. But that means that my role as an owner is going to shift as we start to hire people, as we start to think about things that are bigger than just the projects that we're working on, right? What do we want to do? A lot of people will actually at this point, like at that stage 3, they might actually run for office. They might do a lot of other things outside of the company. And it's for the purpose of building the company later on. But it's just a note that the relationship changes, which is why probably you've probably gotten frustrated at certain points where it feels like, definitely let me know if you've ever had this happen where like, I've had situations in companies before where I will work on an animation and then finish it. And then like 7 weeks later, I'll get some feedback from the heads of the company because that's the only time that they had to look at it, which might mean that I'm already working on other stuff and then I'm juggling around 2 shots at once and it's really confusing or whatever it might be. So if you've experienced that kind of thing, just know that like, usually it's because the owner's relationship with the company is different at that stage. But yeah, for any of you who either are full-time freelancers or thinking about full-time freelancing, or you're an owner, do you have a sense of what stage you're currently in? I would love to know for those folks who are interested in that. Client building, yes. Client building is a whole thing. It's a whole thing, for sure. Yeah, let me know in the chat for sure. I'm very curious where you guys think you're at. Okay. We're going to get into some structure here. So if I want to talk about existence for sure. Yes, I think if we talk about structure, right, we're talking about this idea of production versus business development. Also, shout out there to Christian for having 1 client. That's amazing. That's the best. It's the best thing to have a client. It feels really great. Foundation building, yes. Oh, good. Okay, so you're all kind of right where I might have thought you've been. So that's good. My assumption might be right. Okay, we're going to talk about structure though. We're going to look at some production and business development structure here. So don't get mad when you see this. Here we go. This is a typical animation production. You might look at this and be like, well, where's the pre-production? Where's the rigging? Where's the lighting? This is an oversimplified version of something that you already know, which is these are typically stages of development. This is what a business owner will see when they're thinking about, what actually goes into animation on a day-to-day basis. Like they might have animation experience and know that there's a lot of roles that are being served, but they're only going to see things at the point of specific stages that need to be completed. So, for example, if you're thinking about in terms of video games, sometimes the CEO, the stakeholder, the investor might not see any of what's happening here until the point of alpha, right? An alpha test happening. And in VFX, an investor might not see a version of the animation until animation is already done before, because they can't connect visually the like what's happening in layout versus what's happening in the animation. This can be really frustrating, right? This is where one of those points of frustration hits pretty hard, which is why a lot of people say like it'd be nice to have an owner that does have animation experience, but it's not necessarily that they have to. It's just that it's important for you to see that what they're looking for is different in particular moments in time. This is the kind of relationship that they have with animation production. And then speaking of that, the animation team has a different focus in mind as well, right? So if I want you to think of yourselves, you're an artist right now, you're working on a video game or a movie or whatever it is, what is your focus in that moment in time? What do you think the artist's goals are? What are they focused on as they're working on that feature film, that commercial? Like, put yourself in that artist's shoes for a second, and I want you to write what you think in the chat here, what you think their focus is. What is their goal? Any ideas? To create the best possible work, the best version of the product, probably stressing about deadlines. I feel that. Highest quality that matches deadlines, timelines, enough time given. Yes, time management, getting the job done, making something cool. Yes, I hear that. I'm hearing the deadline thing for sure. Some creative freedom. Mm-hmm. Yes, all of these are true. Pleasing the director's expectations. Yes. Here are a couple that I thought of as well, that we have some similarities here. Creating the best visuals possible within specific constraints given, right? We're always working within certain limitations. And so we want, as an artist, the character animator in me always wants to put in the best visual possible. I would also really want to enjoy making that creative along the way. Somebody mentioned stressing about deadlines. I feel you there. But yeah, hopefully I'm doing that in a way that's actually enjoyable. I also sometimes might want to help push technical boundaries of a production, right? I want to try a new style. I want us to explore something we've never done before. That sounds really fun. And I also want to meet the overall vision of the leadership team. So keep this in mind. Animation productions are focusing on this pretty heavily. Now, what's happening on the business side? There's a lot of different structures for businesses, which I can cover a little bit later. But right now, this exercise is to just look at sort of a traditional, what would be called like a hierarchy model. So you might have seen before, if you've ever heard the term shareholders, that typically means somebody who has like an actual share or stake or piece of the company, like they might own part of the company, or they're just investing money into the company in exchange for a return on that money. So, it might also be boards. So if you hear like board members, stakeholders, shareholders, investors, all of them tend to live at the top. Because you might have seen in certain articles or certain things where like the board sometimes has the ability to fire the executives, right? So they have some clear power. Then you've got your executives, your C-suite, that's your CMOs, your CEOs, your CFOs, your whatever COOs. All of these are acronyms for just people who help run the executive side of the company, right? Creative marketing office, chief marketing officer, chief operations officer, chief financial officer, sometimes chief fun officer if you're a company that likes to have fun names. Then you've got your upper management. So these are people who are leading certain aspects that you might not typically see on, like they're not necessarily heading the department and they're not exactly the CMO, but they might be. They might live in that space. It's a little complicated. But yes, then you have department heads and you have all these departments. And something to keep in mind about these departments is that the smaller the studio, right? I mentioned that you're going to have multiple roles. That typically happens here. A studio CEO might be meeting all of these roles on top of all the other departments that they have to run. Each of these departments has their own section of hierarchy, and they all have individualized focuses. right? So everything you're focusing on as an artist lives here, lives in this one tiny production space. And there's so many other things that are happening on the business side that are important to keep in mind. But just like animation production, businesses also have a focus. And the challenge here is that if all of these departments have their own focus, how do they actually come together to benefit production, right? If you look at each of these things siloed, where like, and these are just kind of summations of what this could be. But if you're seeing that, you know, sales is ensuring that the company can keep operating, because without more sales, we have no money coming in and we aren't able to hire anybody, all that good stuff. And if that's their sole focus, then how are they actually tied into the animation production as a whole? This is something to start thinking about. I think that if we go back to this animation production focus that we had before, the business has a responsibility to help meet the needs of that animation production. So if as an artist, your focus is to create the best visuals possible within the specific constraints given, well, who's setting up those constraints? That's typically, let's say the sales side, they're setting up the constraint after they talked with a client of, okay, we have to do it in 3D. Financial's going to say this is the budget that you have to be able to work within to meet the needs of breaking even for the company or making a profit. They might say that you have to work within 3 months to get this done. And the executives at the top, they're the ones who decided that you're going to work on game cinematics in the first place. So they're helping to limit the constraints that you have to work within. Then if you want to enjoy the process along the way, there might be more people involved in this. But, you know, if you're not enjoying the process, what do you typically do? You go to HR, and hopefully HR will help you as best as they can. You might also be part of the marketing side when they're trying to do their, what do you call that? Like their promotions for the studio, to be like, oh, this is what our company culture is like. This is what everything looks like. So it's just understanding that these two parts have to be aligned. And the only reason why it might feel like there's a lot of barriers to this, or there might be a disconnect, is usually because of the approach of working with those departments, right? I mentioned earlier, how many times have you felt like you've actually connected with any of these other departments that exist? Do you know what's going on with the legal team? I've certainly never met a legal team when I worked at a studio, but now I get to be part of that directly. So it is worth noting that studios have to think about, and especially those of you who are starting a studio, you have to think about the connection between these two places so that they're aligned moving forward and you don't run into that feeling of everything being siloed out, right? They're all working towards the same goal. Okay. A couple quick notes about business models and structure. I wanted to, talk about the idea of running a studio versus full-time freelancing. There's a lot of connections and there's a lot of similarities, but they also have some key differences. A lot of times for full-time freelancers, like they love being actively involved in the creative process, right? They want to continue that. So even if they end up hiring other freelancers or they become more of a consultant or creative director kind of role, they're still directly involved in the creative most of the time. But as you saw earlier, for studio owners, you tend to get less and less and less involved in the creative process because you want to hire out people to do that creative for you so that you can keep focusing on innovation and whatever other business terms you want to use. But you're thinking about your constant future, so you're typically stepping away from the creative over time. So that's something to think about. If you're talking about wanting to start a studio, how involved do you want to be in the creative process? Are you more interested in kind of exploring this sort of new side? I can tell you as an owner that I wrestled with this for years in the studio because I felt that I was getting further and further away from the creative. But now I found that I really love doing that type of work. I still get to do creative, which is great, but I intentionally make that choice to build it into my time. So just something to consider. There are differences there. There are also lots of different models to consider, right? You probably know a lot of these already, whether or not you're going to be a remote studio or you're going to have an office building, whether or not you're going to be a for-profit or nonprofit. You've probably seen a lot of schools and a lot of like animation education focused on the nonprofit side. You could become hyper specialized in one particular style or one particular thing where you like only make explainer videos, or you can be an agency. Agencies tend to be these studios that work on multiple factors. So you might offer animation as one piece, but you also might offer website development, and you might also offer VR work. Whatever that is, you kind of become a little bit broader in the services that you're providing versus a hyper specialized. Do you want to be indie or do you want to be owned? Right? A lot of people will make choices to start studios for the purpose of selling that business later. That is a model that does happen. And it's kind of weird to think as a person going into a company being like, oh, I want to grow with this company, but the company wants to sell themselves later. So how do I, does that feel like a long-term sustainable thing for me? There's no right or wrong way to do this. And there's no judgment for whatever you wanted to do. The idea is just to understand which approach speaks to you, right? So, because ultimately the business structure, the hierarchy that you make, and the type of model that you work with aren't really everything at the end of the day. What matters is the approach that works best for you and works best for your team. So let's say you talk it out, you figure out what you want to do, and you're like, I want to be a remote co-op indie studio that specializes in 2D game cinematics. That's pretty clear. That gives a sense of where you're going. And if you don't know what a co-op is, that model is, I actually really love co-ops. If you're in Canada at all, there's lots of game development co-ops that are supported by the government. So the government will help fund these kinds of things. So keep that in mind. But co-op studios are worker owned. So everybody has a collective say in the business. They vote on certain business decisions. So you are kind of directly involved as an artist on the business side as well for certain business decisions. Okay. I know I've thrown a lot at you. So I want to see if you have any questions as we go through things here. This is a quick break just to kind of shake it all out. I know I'm going to throw a lot more things at you today, but I wanted to give some space to ask any questions that you may have. So, a couple things. Here's what we'll do. The first thing to note is that I do have some weekly office hours that I'm going to be running for any business development questions. So if you're either starting a studio or you're interested in just learning more about the back end of the business, you can always go to those office hours anytime. I think they're usually on Mondays in the States, but I know that I'm not in the States right now. But yes, hopefully those times work for you. If not, let me know. But I'm going to pause for a second. I'll stop sharing for a second. And I'm going to ask you all if anyone has any questions, either in the chat or if you want to come off chat and just ask me something. Let's do that. This question, is it better to start off as a freelancer before starting a new studio? That's a great question. I think if you can, there's no right or wrong way. You can just jump. So for example, I was working at a video game studio for a while, and then I jumped directly into business ownership. I had never done freelancing before, and it was definitely hard. I think it's harder because you don't necessarily have the practice or the skills for the communication side of things and knowing the different roles. But I think either approach you take, as long as you're doing some education for yourself, like taking small business classes and understanding the sort of marketing, sales, communication side of things, then either way you start is totally fine. There's no right or wrong way there. It just depends on what you're looking to get. And you don't have to start a studio with already hiring people. You can start a studio as just yourself kind of figuring it out too. So it's kind of the same model. I hope that answered your question. Okay, do you have any places of reference for starting a co-op? Yes. Have you experienced any hurdles of working with international clients? Ooh, the only challenges usually are, I guess, because I'm currently international for I'm in Japan and I'm working back with my East Coast clients. Are making sure that you have boundaries and expectations set for your time zone specifically, right? If I have a call with a client, We specifically blocked off our time so that they can't schedule a call that would be at like 2 a.m. our time. So we've had to limit the amount of hours that we can both like plan meetings for. There's usually not any challenges with like taxes or things of that nature that I found, but it just depends. Sometimes there's language barriers. Google Translate can only do so much. So I would typically say that it just depends. But it's not a hurdle in the way that like it's impossible or it's really frustrating. It's just making sure you're doing an extra level of communication to make sure that people are on the same page. Okay. How do you find out if you have a head for business? I'm assuming by head you kind of mean like you have a knack for it, maybe, or that you can run the business. I did not know that I could do it. I just thought it would be fun to start a studio. So, and I jumped in with 2 other co-founders at the time, and I learned throughout that messy process of what skills I needed to work on, how I needed to show up as a leader, that kind of stuff. And I learned very quickly, because I mentioned before that I have like really deep anxiety. And a lot of times in certain situations, that anxiety can be used really well. I'm a great risk assessor. If somebody asks us like, hey, we want to do this in the business, what would you think? I can tell you the 800 things that could go wrong with that, which is great for understanding here's the risk and here's what we're doing to make the best informed decision. So hopefully that answered your question. Do you think a studio needs to be hyper specialized to survive? Ooh, that's a good one. No, I don't. Well, so there is a phrase in the business world that says like niche or niche or whatever you want to call it, but niche until it hurts. So you don't necessarily have to hyper specialize on one style, right? But you could start, usually they tell you to go really, really deep into one particular topic, and then you can branch out from there. It's usually there is the risk of like, if you're not building things out ahead of time, if you just start by saying like, oh, well, anyone can use animation, so the first client we'll take is just anybody we can get. Usually it's not that you can't survive, it's that it makes it a pain in the ass to keep going through it because you're constantly then in survival mode and you're not necessarily thinking and planning for strategically about how to move forward. So I think it's more about strategy than anything else. Like if you have a strong strategy and you offer 3 or 4 different things, you start as an agency, you can do that, but you have to be very smart about how you're strategizing moving forward so that you don't burn out throughout that process. Okay. Quick questions here. I might not get to all of these because I know we have more to get through, but what are your thoughts on either having a product before the studio or the studio before the product? We will talk about that. I'm getting to you. Don't worry. That will be in our next section here. When do you define your style, your studio style or outlook? Or do you let the work define it over time? Ooh, that's interesting. I will also get to that. I'm going to pin that because I think that's really, really, really good. That's a great question. In trying to make a business plan, are there templates or similar businesses to animation studios out there? Yes, I will be. There's definitely business plan templates that are pretty generic that apply to not studios, but just small businesses in general. I will be providing you at the end a link to a bunch of resources, which includes just a straight up step-by-step checklist of how to start a studio, just so you have everything in place there. Funding for a studio we are about to get to, so I will get to you there. Lots of questions with funding. Yes. Cool. What are some funding hurdles? Yep, we'll talk about funding in a little bit. How did you land your first client? Heard cold calling is tougher. Yes, it is. I am also going to talk about how to get clients in the next section here. So I will share that story in a little bit. And how did we navigate ownership? That's a great question that I do not have in the slides. So I'll just give you a really quick rundown. Our studio started as 3 co-founders. We actually, when we got started, we talked with a lawyer about how we navigated everything. We decided we wanted to do equal ownership in terms of the split. So we all took at the time, it was like a 33.33333% stake in the company. But legally, somebody has to be the president, and someone has to be the secretary or whatever it is. So we just like kind of picked those out based on what we were doing, but knowing that we were all kind of still serving the same roles. But we had a lot of questions about, there's a thing called a operating agreement that you have to make that basically says, these are things that I didn't consider when we started, but it was basically like, if one of us at the company gets hit by a bus and they die tomorrow, what happens to everybody else? What happens with the shares? What happens to, does the company have the ability for somebody else to get ownership? Can you choose your successor? All that kind of stuff. That gets worked out and negotiated with your lawyer. But yes, and that depends on the model, the business model that you're working with, right? So if you're doing a co-op, that ownership might be split out differently than if you're doing an LLC or a partnership. And I'll show some legal structures in a little bit. Okay. What steps do you take to connect with a new client? We will talk. And starting out, what are your suggestions for finding clients? We will talk. Okay. Great. Okay. If you keep having questions, just definitely post them in the chat. I might not see them until the second half here, but I'll try to go through this as much as I possibly can. There's a lot here, so here we go. Okay, so this section is focused on starting an animation studio and what it actually takes. I like to ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much you might actually need to hustle if we're talking about the Silicon Valley life. I'm here to tell you that you do not have to hustle. You just have to think strategically and be a little bit smarter about your approach. But owning a studio is all about alignment. That's really all it is. It's an alignment between the market, which we just talked about, right? The industry sector that you're going to be in, what the valuation of that sector looks like, and what the market is demanding. So if you're seeing in, for example, if you see in feature film that everybody who wants to make a feature film right now only wants to do it with AI, then that's what the market's demanding. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, right? I'm not saying I agree with that particular thing. I'm just saying if you're seeing that that's what's happening in the market, then you have to be understanding of where you're going to work and adapt within there, right? That might be something that's out of our control. But you also have to align it with your fundamentals. I'm going to use some animation terminology here, right? So the fundamentals are really these kind of core things that you need to know who you're serving, what it is that you're actually building or you're making, and why your studio even exists in the first place. Why does it actually matter? I believe that the fundamentals are based on, if we're talking about animation principles, the character animator and me, I believe that there are some principles that studios are built upon. Whether or not they maintain those over time is a different question. But the foundation, the fundamentals, the principles of building a studio, I believe work in this order. They are identifying your purpose, identifying a problem that you are solving, identifying the people that you're working with and building teams with and working for, and the product that you're making as a result of that. So each of these will basically serve as your foundation that you'll hold on to moving forward. So let's talk about what each of those mean. And the best part is that, to answer a question earlier, all of this can be figured out and solved before you even legally start a studio. You don't have to pay a dime to figure this stuff out. All you have to do is do a little bit of research, spend a little bit of time, and just think through these a little more deeply. So it's great that you don't have to spend $1. The purpose is the emotional foundation, right? This is what's you'll identify it as a core purpose, but it's basically what drives you as a studio. Is having a studio even that important to you? I want to know what you value and what you stand for. Those are some core aspects of identifying your purpose that we'll get into. Then you're going to have a logical foundation of solving a problem. Every company is trying to solve a problem. So what is the problem that you're actually solving for? And you can think about this both internally and externally, right? What problems do you see out in the world, but what problems do you see in the industry? Because you can address both things at once. Then you're going to think about people and going just beyond your internal team, right? Internal and external, same idea. who are you solving the actual problem for? What are the pains that that person has related to that problem? Who is that person? How are you going to connect with them? How do you reach out to them? And then you have these sort of core offerings, the product, what you're actually making. A lot of people will say, is animation a product or a service? It can be both. But I want you to think about it from the product perspective in this moment in time, because you have to figure out what it is that you're actually providing to your client or customer. When they say, if somebody comes to you and they say, I want to make an animated feature, and you're like, okay, great. That feature is one product, right? But if they say, hey, I'm doing a marketing campaign and we need animation and marketing and all this kind of stuff for this stuff, then maybe you're providing a suite of services. But at the end of the day, you're giving them video files. It's a product. So it's just a different way to think about it. But how does that product solve their problem? And is animation actually the best solution for what they need, right? We're all experts in the field in terms of understanding what ways animation can be used to best serve the purpose of the story. But does that mean if a client comes to you and they want to make a documentary, does animation serve the best purpose for it? Or should it be mixed media? Or should it be live action? There's all sorts of ways to think about this. But you have to figure out what you're making for that person. So let's talk about purpose. Your purpose is all about establishing for both yourself and your future team why you're even working together. Why would somebody want to join your studio? This is really kind of a big deal. If you don't actually know what you're aiming for, then it can be really hard to get out of that existence survival stage that we tend to get very stuck in. A lot of studios tend to get started. They've got a cool project under their belt. Maybe they're working on a couple more, but then it's really hard to start to make choices and get to a point where you can say no to things and then really only focus on the things you want. Because if you don't identify the things you want first, then you're just going to be stuck in this we'll take projects wherever we can get. So not having a purpose, I honestly believe, is why most studios will fail before the first 5 years. We see this a lot. There's tons of data around this for small businesses, that most small businesses will fail in 5 years. So if you want to build a sustainable model, this is where you start. You need to have a purpose to make your studio valuable, both to yourself to give you motivation and to other people to go along with you. So there are ways to find your core purpose and to build that. I always like to say to look into your toddler years. When you're a toddler or a kid, do you remember those times where you asked why all the time? And you were like, well, why is the sky blue? Why is this cup white? Why is this, thing plastic? I have no idea. Why? This is an exercise that you can do that really helps to determine your why. If we take a look at an example, this is from, I'm trying so hard to find this blog again, but I found this blog and I loved it, and it gave this kind of idea of how to do this. So if you start with what you think you'll do, let's say you're like, okay, I'm about to start a studio. I want to make an anime TV series for talking about grocery stores. Don't know why, but that's cool, right? So I might ask, well, why is that important? Why is telling stories about grocery stores important? You might be like, oh, well, maybe because I love people watching, and grocery stores always have tons of different characters that I could make stories out of. That'd be cool. Okay, well, why is that cool? Why do you want to tell? Why does it matter? What characters? Why is showing a certain type of character important to you? Oh, well, I don't know. This is where you start getting into it. This is hard work. This is not easy to do. And I'm going to challenge you to do this right now. You're not going to have all the answers. I can tell you that our studio did this. We asked ourselves why we did the 5 times going through it. And it took a long time to figure out. Basically, the idea here is that your studio is bigger than one story idea. Okay, so if you are starting a studio because you have an idea of a type of story you want to tell, right? That's wonderful. But your studio is going to go beyond that one story. So you have to think out a step further back. and say, if this studio is going to, if it's going to be something bigger than myself, then what does that mean? What do I really believe in? What do I care about? So I'm going to give you guys honestly just like 2 minutes. And I know that's not enough time. I can tell you our studio took about 8 hours to do this. And we had it over the course of multiple meetings over multiple weeks. And we took time to really think about this. But I just want you to think about maybe even that first statement or getting to your first why. I'm literally going to put a timer on. I'm going to give, for those of you who are interested in this, like, take some time to think about this right now. And if you're open to sharing in the chat what you come up with, I'd love to hear it. But I'm going to let you do your thing. Give this some thought. And if you have questions about this, put it in the chat and let me know. And I can answer while we're taking the time. Put that in here. Let's see. Yeah, this might be. Oh, nope, that's not for you guys. Okay, there we go. Let me get this. Get all my. Okay, Joshua, thank you for sharing that. I don't think it's the exact one I saw, but it definitely is exactly the same. So thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. I'll add that to our list here of like resources to give you at the end. Thank you. So Sarah, thank you for posting. So you said you'd absolutely love to create the most heartfelt expressions because believability of emotion is super important to you. So that's where I would ask you why. Where does that come from? Where does the, believability of emotion, you're going to have to do all of you will have to end up doing some deep work here to like specifically share your own personal experiences. We actually got pretty deep into our own traumas through this, and we had really heartfelt conversations about it. But it is important to understand, right? Like, why would that matter to you, and then why would that matter to somebody else, right? Because you might believe in the believability of emotions, but does the client? It's a challenge. It's a challenge. Okay. No, this is really great. Thank you for sharing. You want to use 2D and CG animation to redefine LGBTQ stories? Yes, and establish authentic representations. Excellent. So I think you can go further into that, right? Why does it matter that for you specifically that LGBTQ stories are important to tell? Why does that matter? And again, you're not going to have time to do this right now, but because I'll agree with you that it does matter, but why does it matter specifically for you? This is going to be a core that defines your studio for sure. Uplifting marginalized creators, yes. Creating stories that make underrepresented audiences feel seen and celebrated. Yes, again, you can go even deeper into this. You'll eventually get to a place where so we'll stop for a sec since we're already 2 minutes in. The next thing that you basically do is you're going to look at your statement, and you're going, after you go through your 5 whys and stuff, and you're going to find ways to validate that purpose, right? You're going to look at this and say, did you find that purpose personally inspiring to you? Does it make you feel proud of your company that you're making? And can you envision this purpose being valid 100 years from now as it is today, right? If you want, I can give you a little bit of an example of what we ended up coming with. Our purpose, which might seem really strange, is that we want humanity to succeed. It's not like we're going to go ahead and, start blasting that out as a marketing campaign to be like, we want to see humanity succeed. Yeah, that'd be great. It's more about understanding if that's where we're coming from, how do we go about doing that through the medium of animation, right? So it took us a long time to get there, and there's more to that, but that's kind of like the core purpose that we are now serving. Okay. From a purpose perspective, you have to also align that purpose with your value. So if your purpose is the why behind everything that you're doing, then your values are how you'll move forward with that purpose in mind. So if we take a look at this is the idea that if you want to save the world, wonderful, big uplifting purpose, sure. But you do it through patience, integrity, and kindness, because those are the values that you hold. It might look a little bit different of an approach than if you're doing it through your values of efficiency, innovation, and organization. Now, these are, again, no right or wrong way here. One is not better or worse than the other. It's just to say that you might have the same goal. You and another studio might have the exact same goal or the exact same purpose, but how you're doing it and the approach that you're going to take is going to be wildly different because you might have different values that you're bringing to the table. So there are tons of, we're not going to go through a values exercise today because there's so many of them out there. Like you can do a quick Google search and just be like, how do I discover my values? It's there. But all of that to say is that you have to do the work of understanding your purpose and your value. Hopefully that made sense. Okay, we're going to get into our second P here, the problem, right? So you are ultimately solving for a problem in a company. Every company has a problem to solve. You can think about it from these 3 different types of questions. You can think about it as like, what is the basic need that you're trying to fulfill? Because you're trying to get clarity around what the problem is. What is the desired outcome for that particular purpose, right? You're aligning this idea of whatever they're trying to get or whatever problem they're trying to solve with the purpose that you have in mind. And who stands to benefit from it and why. You want to humanize this aspect of understanding that problems can be solved for people for purpose and humanity. Let me share an example of what I mean by this, because you do have to think about these both internally and externally. So I'll give you an example. That example is straight up that here, me teaching you today, I actually want to build out a full course about this type of stuff. And the reason why is that on the internal side, I am seeing that new studios tend to fail within the first 5 years. But externally, I'm hearing that many industry professionals want to start studios but don't have access to business development training, right? So they're failing not necessarily because of anything that's out of... it might be out of control factors, but it might just be that they don't have access to the information that they need. So this is one problem that I am trying to solve for. And if I look to say, like, what's the outcome of that? Well, I want studios to cross-collaborate and make really cool shit. Like, that's really what I want to do. The artist in me wants to do that. So it's worth understanding. We won't go through everything here, but you have to understand that you're solving a problem both for yourself internally, for the studio, right? So you might look at, a good example is like, you could look at a studio and maybe like pick any studio that you either look up to or that you're skeptical of or whatever it might be. But look at that studio and say, okay, what problem are they solving for, right? What are they in the studio? Are they solving for like making sure that people are getting hired appropriately? How are they doing that, right? What is the desired outcome that they have for their end client? You can kind of do an analysis here. And I know I'm kind of roughly, we don't have time to get into everything here. But the idea is that you want to be able to understand your basic needs and the problem that you're solving for on both fronts. Hopefully that makes sense. But if you have questions, let me know. Okay. Now, who actually even buys animation? Who are you solving problems for in the world, right? If you're trying to save humanity, what kind of problem are you seeing in humanity? Maybe it's something like climate change. Well, who's going to buy animation for climate change? Well, people are going to do that. But there's people on both the internal and the external side again. So let's dive into this. So who actually drives your business. These are the people that are going to be funding your animation, right? There are kind of three distinct categories here. If you ever heard B2B or B2C or B2G, those are just acronyms. You'll hear acronyms in every business facet in the world. But it just means business to consumer or client or customer, any of those C's, or business to government. Somebody mentioned government earlier in the chat today, which is great. There are many different types of relationships that you'll have with these clients. I use the word clients all the time, so just keep that in mind. But basically, let's say you're an animation studio and you are making cinematic trailers for video games. That's a pretty clear one. Your relationship with your client is probably going to be another animation studio, right? Because it might be a video game studio that's hiring a 2D animation company because they're doing a 3D game and they want a 2D video game trailer. I've seen a lot of those happen. So there's definitely studios that do that type of work. You might also, if you're a business to consumer, your customer might be the person who's buying a game, right? The gamers of the world. These are the most direct relationships that we have because they control your financial success, especially if you're not going the investor route, which we'll get into. And then, of course, you have business to government. If you decide you want to go into the government world, it's a whole other world to get into, let me tell you. It is probably the most tedious one. It requires a lot of paperwork, a lot of legal structure, a lot of time. Typically, government is the worst in terms of paying out to yourself. So I don't have this plan, but if you're talking about finances, I'll mention it a little bit later. But government takes the slowest amount of payout. Okay. With any of those client types, you need to understand that they have needs and that they have pains. Their needs are very straightforward, right? What do they need from your service that you're providing or the product that you're making? So they might say, well, I need an animated explainer video and I need to translate it into multiple languages, right? That's their need. They come to you, they say, hey, I need this thing. You say, okay, great, I can make that. But they also have pains that they're coming in with, because at the end of the day, you have to understand, why does meeting that need actually matter to them, right? And I'm not talking necessarily about the company as a whole. I'm talking about the individual that you're talking with. You're having a relationship with this person. So in my case, let's say a marketing director from a small business comes to us and they say, hey, we want this animated explainer video. I say, okay, great. I start asking a bunch of questions really to understand more of their pain. Yes, I'll have questions about the logistics. How long is the video? How many days do we have to do it? That kind of thing. But then I might also ask them other questions to be like, what kind of relationship are we working with in terms of, I won't ask it this way, but I'm trying to understand how many people are on their team so that I know whether or not there's going to be too many cooks in the kitchen on this project. Am I doing this video for somebody else? What are the pains that their audience has, right? If they're a marketing company for shoes and they're getting a bunch of complaints that people don't know how to tie shoes, just roll with me here, then they might have some anxiety around this because they're getting complaints in real time. So they might be like, oh, well, we need this done really quickly because we're, we don't have enough education and people are upset with us and, we want to get it done. So you are now addressing your client's needs and their pains on both fronts. You have to manage both the emotional and the logical foundation here that you're working with this team. So this is just something to keep in mind. This isn't, we don't have time to get into all of it, but just understand that you're solving for more than one problem when you're talking about the client and what they need and their expectations. Okay, that's what's happening. This is everything that's happening on the external side, your relationships with your clients. On the internal side, your people are going to be driving your studio, right? If the client is the thing that's driving your business and the success of your business from a funding perspective, then your creatives and your team on the business side are going to be driving the studio. They're going to be carrying the studio the whole way through to make sure that you can meet the needs of those external customers. So you need to do some work as well here to understand what they need and what their drive is and what their motivation is, right? What do the artists care about throughout that production so that you can make a better experience for them, right? I'm sure every creative here could tell you, like, here are the 800 pains I've had when working with different studios. I've had tons of them, even my own. And so you have to ask this both on the creative side and the business side. And if you're just starting a studio, you're serving both of these roles. So you have to think about this for yourself. You have to say, okay, if I'm a marketer and I have to market this out, what would I be frustrated by about the process? What motivates me as a marketer to make sure that I'm getting the most information out to our potential client as humanly possible? So just note that when we're talking about people, we're talking about people on two different fronts. So I'm asking you, who is the type of relationship that you want to have externally, and what type of environment are you creating internally? That's what to take away from this. Okay. The big one, how do studios make money? I know a lot of people have this question. They want to know the foundations of this. I'm going to do my best to go through this as fast as I can. They make money by understanding what their product is. This is the final step here. You want to recognize what it is that you're actually selling. So we're going to go through an example. I want you to look at this studio. This is my own company. So I didn't want to do this to any other company. I want you to look at these images, and based on what you're seeing here, I want you to tell me what you think this animation studio makes. What do they actually produce? I will not, there's no judgment. I will not criticize this. Advertising, explainer, educational content, explainer videos. Explainers. Oh, that's pretty clear. PSAs. Ooh. Okay, animation to bring awareness, advocacy content. Ooh, all very good. Okay, great. Let's put a pin in that for a second. Hold on to that. Hold on to that idea. Products are very intentional because you have to dive a little bit deeper into just the idea of making an explainer video, right? You want to understand that your product has to have aligned incentives, it has to have a specific outcome, and it has to have defined results. So let's get into what each of these means. An aligned incentive is that you have to know that your product is much about you as it is the impact and the experience that you're providing to your customer. So at the end of the day, people are buying from other people, right? If you're building, all of this is all about building relationships with other people. So you need to know that if your client has a certain amount of incentives or things that they care about, you have to be aligned as much as you can with what they're needing. So for example, let's say you hear from the client during that sales call that they really care about making sure that everyone is always on the same page, like as much as humanly possible. You're hearing the anxiety in their voice. They're like, we need to make sure that, like, you know, everyone's just on the same page and everyone has everything they need. And I want to make sure that, like, I get everything laid out for email. Do you want email? Do you want Discord? What do you want to do? If you hear that, you might see that as maybe there's not an alignment there, or maybe there is, because you care about having a flexible schedule. And so you might say, oh, okay, well, I'm open to, why don't we hop on a call every 2 days a week? We'll set the time and place, and we'll always do regular check-ins at that time. Now you're getting the need for their consistent communication and making sure you're on the same page. And you get the sense of knowing what's in your schedule that's a hard deadline and where else you can be flexible to those needs. So it's worth understanding just the idea of you're working towards the same goal, but you might have different ways to get there. Same idea that we talked about before, but making sure those internal incentives are aligned around the project and the project experience, right? It's not just the product itself, it's the experience you're providing along the way. Those have to be as aligned as possible to build a good relationship with the client. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. The other idea here is that you have specific outcomes, right? Your client has an idea of what they actually want. They're going to tell you what they want. But you have to figure out what the tangible outcome is that they're looking for in that idea, right? What is the client getting as a result of purchasing your product or service? And Outcomes typically need to be specific or strategic and serve an interest of the client's target audience. This might be a little confusing, but just to break it down, this really comes down to what you're actually making. Okay, so you're making something both on the logical front and the emotional front. The logical is the deliverable. This is that tangible product that you're going to provide to your client. So let's say they come to you, they say, hey, I want a 3-minute video game trailer delivered at 4K that I'm going to put on YouTube. Okay, great. That is the logical that they are providing for you. What are you really providing though? You're providing an emotional impact both to the client and the audience that's going to be watching said video, right? This is the experience that you're providing for them. So as a different example, let's say, the client wants their donors or their audience to be really proud that they're putting money towards a good cause. How do you make that? How do you put that into a product, right? You might say, oh, well, that comes through in the story. Great. That might be part of what you're building. But you have to know that you're building on 2 different fronts here. So if we go back to looking at the studio and what they actually make, the deliverables, right, that in this case, these were 2D motion graphics animated explainer videos. But the impact in that way was that we were informing the public about local and federal policy changes that affected their communications directly, or their communities directly. So a lot of these videos were made specifically to, as like working with nonprofit organizations and sometimes for-profit companies that are trying to hyper-localize a need to their community. And we wanted to inform the community about what was changing, either policy bills, laws, all that kind of stuff. So we're making a different kind of impact than just 2D explainer videos, right? So I want you to think about this when you're thinking about your product. What are you actually making, and what is the impact that's going to happen as a result of those products? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, the last one here is defined results. Are the deliverables and the impact that you're providing actually effective for your audience and for your client? You can measure this in a bunch of different ways. You can talk with your client and say, hey, how'd that explainer video do that we put out into the YouTube world? Did it succeed? Did it not? Why or why not? There's also, that's what's happening on the external side for the product. On the internal side, you're thinking about the actual experience again that you had with your client. So let's say you delivered the product, which is great. They got the project, they got everything done in time. But the impact is their retention rate. Are they going to come back and hire you for more stuff? What was that experience like for them? Did you talk to your client about that experience? Do they have some advice for ways to improve along the way? All of that, again, we don't have time to get into all of it, but it's just worth noting that your product is based off of these kind of foundations. So it's worth thinking about. Okay, I know this is a lot. But basically, for starting a studio from start to not finish, from just start, you are going to write these principles down for yourself. This is kind of your follow-up homework for after this meeting. You're going to identify what your purpose is. You're going to figure out the problem that you're solving for somebody. You're going to figure out who you're solving for, and you're going to figure out what it is that you're actually making for them. This foundation might change over time, but so it doesn't need to be perfect. You just need to know that once you have these, it's really easier to figure out the next steps moving forward. Because ultimately, your principles are clarifying what the business is for you, for yourself. You might have heard from other companies or small business talks where they'll be oh, you have to have a mission statement and a vision statement and do all this stuff first. I think you have to do that afterwards, after you figure it out for yourself. Because your mission and vision are really what you're putting out to other people to clarify to others, this is what I'm doing. This is what we're about, right? All of that great information from your principles are going to be turned into single sentence statements, which is not easy to do. But it will hopefully clarify this is what we're doing. And your strategy will determine how you get there, meeting the needs of your purpose and your value and all that stuff. So hopefully you're seeing a thread of connection start to flow here. That's hopefully my intention for you today. But I know you had some extra questions, so I'm going to spend, I know we're already at an hour and a half, I'm going to spend probably another 10 minutes on the last bonus steps here that I know a lot of you wanted to get into today. So what comes next? Legal structure, funding, and pricing, right? These are some big ones. And hopefully I'll run some more stuff, but we'll get through this as quickly as we can. So if we go back to that early business structure, right, you have some departments that are sort of core fundamentals that you're going to build your company off of. These four, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these four departments, and this I consider executives a department in a lot of ways. These are going to be the founding blocks. You don't necessarily, if you're starting a studio and you don't have anybody, you don't need to focus on HR right now. It's okay. You don't necessarily need to focus on marketing either. If your first sale or your first client's going to come from somebody you know, which is pretty common. But if we take a look from a legal structure perspective, this is available to you from the Small Business Administration. If you go onto their website, they have a list of all of the different structures for business. You can be a sole proprietorship, you can be an LLC, you can have a corporation. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here. You should read through all of the pros and cons that come with this. They have different tax structures and different purposes. I can tell you that our company we're a limited liability company, but we file our taxes as an S corporation, which just means that we are basically considering ourselves W-2 employees, so that when tax season comes around, we don't have a big tax burden because we're taking out taxes from our payroll every single 2 weeks. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, it's worth noting that there's a lot of different structure that you can go with. That's all I want to note for now. It's worth doing the research on and seeing what speaks to you. Okay, financial structure. Where does money actually come from? How do people get money in studios? Funding actually comes from many different sources. I believe there are 8 of them. If you think of more, let me know, because I would be curious about this. But essentially, if you're looking at funding sources, they each have their own pros and cons. The bootstrapping method, if you've never heard this word before, it just means that you're self-funding the company, basically. So you wouldn't have, until you get your first sale for the business, or you've put money into the business as a choice. Like when we started our company, I think we each put in, $4,000, so that we all had equal ownership in the company. And then that got us started for paying for some of our admin software and just enough to get by, so that after we got our first sale and our first client, then we could keep going from there. So it's up to you. I mean, you don't have to put $4,000 in. You can put in $20 a month for a software license that you're using for production, whatever it is that might be. But typically, it's a slower process. You can go through investment, right? You can work with investors. Investors are always going to want a return on that investment. There's lots of things about investors that we'll talk about and I can answer questions on. But essentially, investors sometimes they'll have ownership of the company. Sometimes they will have investment just from a public shares situation, and sometimes they'll have it from just getting a return on that money directly with interest. So there's lots of different ways that investors think about funding your studio. But these are usually venture capitalists that will give you money for your company, but that you have to pay back over time with interest. Same thing with debt financing. This is just going through like a bank, basically getting out loans. You can get out a loan if you're working. This is a pretty common thing you'll see in a lot of studios where like maybe they got a deal for a big feature film that they're working on. And they say, okay, great. We need, $500,000 to get started because we need that working capital now to be able to hire people right away for this project. So they might take out a loan. They might go into debt. Debt financing is a very real thing that a lot of big corporations do, where they will actively stay in debt the whole time. I, as an anxiety person, cannot do that. I would go crazy. But it is something that people genuinely do. So it's good to keep in mind. If you're thinking of going the nonprofit route, fiscal sponsors are a way to consider getting funding for your company. These are companies that will fund your project, and they will also help you build relationships with other people. They might also help work on the back end of your business if you need that extra support. I see a +1 to fiscal sponsors. Yes, they can be really, really helpful. I know in the indie feature film space, a lot of people will use fiscal sponsors, especially in live action. So if you have questions about that, like start talking to some people on the live action side of things or in the indie film space. They do this a lot. Crowdfunding, you'll know, obviously this is your Kickstarters of the world, your Indiegogos, your coffees, whatever project you're using, but that's a direct relationship to a consumer, right? They're giving you the money directly for what you need. There are some benefits to that. I think a con is that you have to pay taxes on that revenue. So just keep that in mind. It's not like if you're asking for, $200,000 to make a short film, let's say, you still have to pay taxes on that. That's not just free money. That's not how the government works. Yes, you have to pay taxes. So then you have licensing. You've probably heard this before, but basically the best way to think about it is that it's basically a subscription service. So that you're licensing out, like if you're working on I'll give you an example of a project we didn't end up getting, but that was going to be licensed, where we were actually going to do an animation for a hospital. And that hospital had a mascot that they wanted to animate for children to show them that surgery, like to get them educated on what the surgery process was like for them, so that it didn't feel so scary. And so they decided that licensing would be a way to go about paying for it. So they would pay us over time every single month, which is great in the sense that you have a steady cash flow coming in, so you know where your money's coming from every month, but can be a little concerning if they don't keep that license going over time. Usually licenses will last anywhere from 1 to a couple of years, and then after that point, that money might just be gone. So something to keep in mind. Grants are another thing. They take a long time to figure out. They're great for both operational side and for production management. Sometimes they're project based. They're harder to find though, and they're usually a longer paperwork process. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting that way, but you can do it. A lot of people do that in the indie film space for sure. And then wouldn't it be all nice if we just got a ton of money as an inheritance from somebody, from friends and family, that if it's a legitimate inheritance, you don't have to pay taxes on it. But yes, inheritance is one way that people do get money for their studio. So it's worth noting that it does exist. But yeah, I'm curious if knowing what you now know, which one you might be interested in pursuing, knowing that they come with different pros and cons, or what direction your company goes in. We're currently in the bootstrapping method for our studio, but we have looked into grants, and we are debating maybe even having a side of our company that would be more of a nonprofit that could use fiscal sponsors. So it's not to say you have to have one or the other. So I'm curious if you have any ideas of what you're pursuing and why. So feel free to let me know. But I'm going to keep going in the interest of time. So the last thing we'll go into, you're doing crowdfunding and bootstrapping. Bootstrapping, crowdfunding, looking into grants. Excellent. Nice. Oh, good. Crowdfunding investors. Ooh, investors. Oh, fun. Okay. We'll talk about that at some point. Cool. Great. All right. So let's talk about pricing models. I know I still have some stuff to get to, so I'm sorry I'm taking so long. But pricing model terminology, there's a lot here. You do not have to know all of this, but I just want to get you started in thinking about knowing that it does not matter which option you choose for what pricing model you go with. What actually matters is what the client is going to see at the end, because all of these different models can get you to the same number. So let me give you an example. Basically, let's say it takes 2 hours for me to make one single cup, this beautiful cup that I've worked on over the last 2 hours. And you, as a client, want to pay me for 10 cups. Well, if I do that as a flat rate, I can charge you $15 per cup times 10 cups. That would be $150. I could get that same price by charging an hourly rate because it takes me 2 hours to make each cup times 10 cups, and my rate is $7.50 an hour. That should not be your rate, but just roll with me here from a numbers perspective. Or I can do this as a project fee where, it takes me 2 hours to make 1 cup, but the project you're asking me for is 10 cups. Now the scale has changed. So I'm going to charge you a project rate for making these 10 cups at this particular moment in time, right? At the end of the day, the number is exactly the same, but the client is the one who's going to see how they're interpreting this information. So you're just trying to create ease for the client when you're showing what your total cost of a project is. And we're going to talk about that project cost. So you basically, all you need to understand is that you have to put purpose into every dollar that's earned. So if you look at a studio, if you typically we'll think about this in this way, where we'll say, okay, they're asking me to do an animated explainer video. I'm going to do that at a rate of $30 an hour, and I know it's going to take me 40 hours to do, right? And 100% of my time and effort is going into that animation because that's what the animation costs. That's great that that's what the animation costs, but that's not what the business costs, right? If you're doing things at cost, you're actually losing money and you will not have the ability to grow. The reason why is that you have to consider a certain set of budget considerations for both the project and for the company. So when you're thinking about the project side, you're like, oh, well, are there any revisions included in this? Am I hiring out people for this? What's the average time on calls with clients? All of those constraints are going to determine, okay, it's not just animation. I'm spending more on a couple other things here. And then on the business side, you're saying, okay, well, am I paying for health insurance for those people that I'm hiring? Do I have to give them a 401k? What are my total administrative costs? If I'm using Airtable and Zoom for all of our calls and Harvest for tracking my time and whatever other tools I might be, what are the costs of those that have to go into the project? How much are you putting away for taxes? All sorts of things to consider. So I'm going to have you do this for a sec. I want you to think about on either the business side or the production side, what are some line items, if you were thinking about this like a table, what are some things that you need to incorporate into the budget? Because it's not just animation, right? There's so many other things to consider. So what is the company paying for in addition to the creative? Any ideas here? There are no wrong answers. Equipment, yes. Electricity, if you have a space, absolutely. LLC renewal, that's every state's like that. Don't worry. Yeah, I think for us it's about $500 a year. Studio rent, people, software, food. Ooh, food is on our list. Software, hardware, home office, yes. Rent, overhead, revisions. There's so much here. Okay, you were all spot on. Commuting, yes. Little wins for sure. Yeah, this is just a very rough example here. But if you think about this idea that the actual cost of a project is so much more than the production itself, right? If you go back to that hierarchy list of all the other departments, you're not just paying for the one production department. You're paying for all of the needs of all the other departments. So all of those have different administrative software. You're paying health insurance for all of your employees. You're paying taxes. So as a rule of thumb, you should always put a certain amount of money away on every project for taxes so that when tax season comes around, you already have your taxes set away and you just pay. Then you might have legal fees that you're dealing with that year. You might have a budget for education where you're like, oh, well, we want our employees to be able to do workshops throughout the year. That's an education budget that you need to set aside for. So if that $1,200 is no longer covering all of the extra fees, you're actually losing money here. So you have to be mindful of when you're budgeting. It's not just the task that you're being asked to do. There's so much more that goes into that. So just keep that in mind. And you're going to end up creating whatever these line items are for yourself. Every business is different, right? If you're a full-time freelancer, rent is a big one too. Okay. All right, last thing here. Getting clients. How do you find the right client? This is a pretty straightforward question. You meet them where they're at. Okay, so if you have a client that's working in, let's say, the video game space, right? And you're going to conferences that are graphic design focused. they might not be there. You might be going to the wrong places and not actually building a relationship. Your goal is to build a relationship with any person that you come across, because you never know how they might, just like they say for getting a job in the industry, it's all about who you know. A lot of times getting clients is about forming relationships and making new relationships with who you know. Wherever they're at, like a big one for us is we work sometimes with producers, and producers work in both live action and animation. So if I'm going to animation conferences, that's great. But if I'm not also going to live action conferences, then I'm missing out on the opportunity to go connect with them. And I'm not saying you always have to go physically out to conferences and shake hands and do all that kind of like extrovert stuff. You can absolutely find them through online forums and just have conversations there. You can connect with somebody on LinkedIn and say, hey, do you want to meet up for a virtual coffee? Like, there's lots of different ways to think about this. But I would start at the local level to see it depends on the company you're trying to make, of course. But if you're trying to do like a business to business relationship, you can start locally and expand from there. There are lots of times where you'll meet people who don't realize that animation is a good opportunity for them. So you have the opportunity as the expert in the room. Sometimes in that case, you might be the only expert in that room, which is actually great. They'll listen to you. We've had a lot of luck over the years when we got started at the local level, just going to local networking events and seeing what opportunities were in the area to learn about the market. Okay, I've got some final pieces of advice. I'm sorry I went so over. Take a breath. Everyone should take a breath. I'm going to take one right now. Okay, this was a lot of information. I want you to know, for upcoming future owners, if you're really interested in still starting this, you need to identify your purpose really strongly, because as you saw in the beginning, everyone has a very similar reason to start a studio, but your purpose is going to be different because it's yours. It's your own. It's what matters to you and why. And it's going to come from your lived experience, your personal experience, and that matters. So put that into your company as you're identifying what your purpose is. You're going to have to be mindful of the audience. The audience is changing over time. I don't even know what's going to happen with things like TikTok coming up soon. But, audience changes, platform changes, the place that they might go to changes. So just be aware of where your potential audience that you're trying to reach, your potential clients, where they're actually showing up and where they go to. You're going to have to think about this rapidly changing landscape, right? AI is a very real threat in our industry. And so you need to be informed at least about how it works and what's happening with it and what's happening in the law with it, so that you can adjust accordingly. And you can make informed decisions about how you're going to handle that situation, because it is here. And then I do believe in fighting for workers' rights and just being better people to our employees and the people we work with and love. You're going to need to develop some policies. A big one, as an example, is like an AI policy. If you say we don't want to work with any form of AI, you have to define what AI is. Because generative AI is going to be different than like using a tool like an automated thing through like Airtable, let's say, to do some back-end work. So you have to be very mindful about very clearly defining your policies for your team. Okay, my last piece of advice, definitely check out the Small Business Administration. They have free workshops and courses all the time. Sometimes they'll have them locally in your area. You can start looking into things like business certifications if you want to be women, LGBTQ, minority, or veteran owned. All of those come with different levels of credibility. Sometimes they get you extra access to meeting with new types of clients. And then also start looking into grants and other funding sources. Grants on the film side can come through local grants. I would start looking at the local level first to be like, oh, I might live in this small community. I live in like Western Massachusetts, so I'm not near Boston. But there's a lot of like creative grants that exist in my area to support the arts, and they consider animation as an art. So I could look into grants to help fund some of the things that I want to do. Okay, very last things here. Don't forget, I really encourage you to be a part of the solution to this industry. I think it's wonderful that you want to start a studio, but be very conscious about why you want to start that studio. Do not leave important things like DEI out of your budget and out of your conversations. Be very mindful that if we're wanting to build studios that are equitable, that there are different extra steps you have to take. You might have to get some more education on your front. I will have resources for that. Start tracking your time and gathering data for what you need. You can track your time just on your animation. If you say, okay, I'm getting a character animation project right now, here's how much time that took. Now you have a subset of data that you can work off of to be like, if another company comes to you with another animation project, you can kind of cross compare to be like, oh, I have this idea that character animation for this one took me this long, so this might take me about the same amount of time because the parameters are the same. So just keep that in mind. Start tracking your data now, and it'll get you pretty far later on. Find accountability partners, people who are going to help you. You are not alone in this. I really encourage you to seek people outside of the animation industry. We have probably, I think at this point, maybe like a dozen people that we could turn to who are in marketing, sales, advertising, business development, that we could just ask questions to, that we can take information and apply that to our business. And they have nothing to do with animation. And it actually is really, really helpful to get outside of just looking at everything from one lens. So keep that in mind as you're kind of building out some, like if you're building an advisory board, let's say. And then please do not put all of your eggs into one basket. If you're not ready to jump into being a studio owner full-time yet, you do not have to. I think financial stability for everyone comes first. We were, when we started the studio, I had quit my job, but I had intentionally a backup plan. I was working, I think, part-time. I think I was like, what was I doing? I was like taking care of kids. I think I was working at like a camp. But the business will still be there at the end of the day. If you need to pay rent today and you need to take care of your shit today, then do that. You can always, after work, dive a little bit into this purpose and dive a little bit into solving the problems and writing that stuff down, because you don't need to have the business set up to do that, right? So take your time. It's okay. And have a backup plan. Honestly, our studio has backup plans. I cannot guarantee the success of my business forever. I'm happy with where we are, but I recognize that the industry is really hard. And if our studio doesn't survive, I know what I plan to do afterwards. So just keep that in mind, that's like you're building something for the future, but it might not stay there for the future. Life changes. This is part of life. So just be mindful of that as you're going forward into this crazy journey. I think being an owner is really about building relationships, meeting people, trying to be the best person that you can possibly be. I will tell you, as owners, one of the best things our studio ever did was we, in one of our line items for our budget, we straight up have a therapist. We have a business therapist that we work with every single month to talk about different issues in the company. If we have either cultural differences between us or we have just communication challenges that we don't know how to solve together, she really works through it and helps us understand what where we're not seeing each other or where we're not eye to eye. It's really important to that requires deep work. It requires understanding yourself a little bit more deeply about who you are, where you want to be, how you show up as an owner. So it's as much about building and developing yourself, which does require you to be vulnerable, as it does building out the logistics of the company. Okay. So I want you to know you have power in this moment. I'm really excited for all of you who want to start your own studio. Take that power, run with it, own it, be proud of it. And so, yes, that is where I'm going to leave you today. For resources, I want to give you a couple of things on my personal website. I have a website page now that's just called business-of-animation. I will have you'll see on there's like a link to a bunch of different things. My office hours are available. I have a form for an Ask Me Anything that you can just add to, and I'm going to make videos on LinkedIn to kind of answer those questions. I'm not the only person teaching this kind of stuff, so please take a look at the other courses. If you're interested in the DEI course, I took one called Animated Perspectives, run by Samantha Goff. Wonderful, wonderful human being. Did an amazing job of explaining why DEI is so integral to the animation industry. So if you're interested in stuff like that, you'll have a list there. So please go to it. I will also, somebody asked about slideshows. I will put that together for you. I'll send that out as a big giant PDF that you can go through and follow. And then the very last thing I will mention is I plan on building out an entire course for this, right? If this is just 101, we have not really we didn't dive into hiring, we didn't dive into IT, we didn't dive into taxes, we didn't dive into like really pricing, we didn't talk about cash flow. Like there's so much more here that we can do. But I hope to be able to to build a course and make it out for free. If you are interested in buying me a chai along the way, you can. I have a coffee page for this. And my goal is to have a little bit of money so that I can, use that as part of my time to build out this course and then offer out the course to everybody. So that's my intention. But yes, that is an optional thing. You don't have to do that. I just appreciate it. Okay. Any questions? I know I threw a lot at you today. Your brains might be fried. I appreciate all the thank yous. I'm so glad that this has been helpful. Any final questions that you want me to answer? If not, I will leave you to your day because I know that there was a lot to cover. One question, yes. What steps do you usually take to connect with a new client aside from meeting people? Yes. So when I define, for example, my purpose around saving humanity right now, I'll just be transparent with you. We are actually our company is pivoting right now. We're actually looking really deeply into things like climate change. And so that's the type of client that we're seeking right now, people in the climate space. So for me, I have gotten one approach I've taken is that I've joined a bunch of different groups. I'm taking a course in a couple weeks. It's like a 12-week boot camp all about understanding climate so that when I talk to potential clients that I have a little bit more information. Because sometimes usually they're going to be the experts of the field that they're working in, right? So they're going to have much more knowledge about climate change and climate initiatives than I will. But I want to have enough information that I have a slightly even playing field to be able to talk with them about it and how animation ties into it. So I'm getting educated. I am joining groups like Women in Climate, Work on Climate, Slack channels. Everybody in the group has been incredibly supportive because I'll usually just ask for advice. I'll be like, hey, I'm thinking about animation for climate change. Have you guys experienced this? What is it like? What's the issues right now? And people are just willing to talk and share. And that helps you build relationships. So just building, becoming part of the community that's there is really helpful. So once I usually connect with those potential people, then that's where it might not work until later down the road where I just had a client recently. We're starting a project right now that's a character animation project that the client emailed me saying, hey, we met 2 years ago at a networking event and now we're ready for animation. So you don't know how long it'll be before the client will show up, but when they do, it's really worth it. How should new studios react or adapt to mounting political atmospheres? Ooh, that's a loaded question. Okay. You have to be mindful that politics will always be involved in studio development. And one of the best analogies I can think of for this is I read a book called The Queens of Animation. If you've never read it, it's really, really good. But there was a single sentence in that book that really sparked something in me because it talked about Walt Disney. And at one point, Walt Disney had to, he got basically a call from the president at the time, president of the United States. And they were like, hey, we need to, this is such a summary, but we need to we need to bridge ties with Brazil. Can you go to Brazil and like start getting some concept art and making a movie to celebrate, Latin American culture, and celebrate Brazilian culture and celebrate Spanish culture? And it was like that level of power is crazy to me. The idea that like you're just going to fly off to another country and build relationships with an entire country through one single animated movie. That's wild. But that's the idea that like a lot of times politics is going to be affected. So for us, we have to be mindful of what AI regulations are going to be in place, if any, right? We know we have in the US a new political administration that's coming in. So what does that mean as a business? Your taxes are probably going to change. Sometimes that might be for the better. Sometimes it might be challenging. So I think you have to, in terms of reaction, it's like definitely get out of the idea of thinking about it from a social media perspective, because a lot of times, like when certain things happen, like if we could look back to the murder of George Floyd, right? In that moment, all of a sudden we started seeing the wave on social media of like companies being like, I have to say something about this. I have to put myself out there. You technically do not have to do anything about that, so long as you're having conversations internally about what you're going to adapt and change to. So the way people perceive things on social media is not the same as what's happening on a business internally. We, like as a studio, if you go to our Instagram, we haven't posted in months. We've been busy. And like, I'm very conscious about this idea of like, I know internally what we're doing for our company. We're building out AI policies right now. We're trying to define what that means for us. We're following politics pretty closely on a day-to-day basis to understand where that's going to affect us, both in our state and in the country, so that we can better show up for our employees, for our clients, for anybody that's going to come through our doors, regardless of whether or not we post something on social media. So just be mindful of that as it's important to be conscious of what's happening so that you can make the most informed decision possible. I hope that answered your question. Likely a balanced approach to not get caught up so we can stay focused on our projects. Yeah, for sure. Okay. With that, I think those are all the questions that happened. I hope this was helpful. I know I went through a lot. I know a lot of people dropped off along the way, which is totally fine. Thank you for sticking around for however long you did. I really appreciate it. And I'll send you resources and everything to follow up with. So good luck out there. I'm excited for you to start businesses. Keep me posted and we'll be in touch. All right, so have a good one. I'll talk to you soon.